Same old G, I feel your pain. I haven't felt it for a while, but the memory is strong enough that it still stings me to this day. In your recent video about perception and intuition versus narrating as the voice or the hand of God, I really understand your frustration. So your question boils down to, what should I have done? Right. And in part, that's a question only that you and your group can answer. And you mentioned that half of your players had a good time, and the other half said, we really should have gotten an intuition check, or in another game system like Call of Cthulhu, that would be like the no roll. But what this boils down to at the end of the day is that the majority of the people have a good time in every scene around the table. Now, you were frustrated by this because basically they didn't get it. They didn't realize they were in a ghost town, and no matter how desolate or empty you made it seem, they didn't want to accept that there was nobody there. And I really think that was the core of your specific problem, not anything else. I think you were probably describing it great. But for some reason, perhaps, they were worried that if they didn't search the place thoroughly, that something would happen to them there. Or whatever other item was on their agenda. They had gone to this place, this deserted place, for a reason. They could have left, I assume, at any point, but there was some reason for them to be there. And because of limited visibility, because of the heavy snowstorm, there was enough doubt in their minds that the place was abandoned, that they weren't willing to commit to the idea that the place was a ghost town. One thing that sounds a little different from how you conduct games around your table and how I do it around mine is this idea of the players calling for, or the players making, perception checks on their own. This is not something which I encourage at my table, and it's often one of the things that my players will correct in the behavior of new players when they join. In order to keep the game going as immersively as possible, the only person who will interrupt it by calling for a roll is me. And we try and keep it as minimal an influence as possible, but basically that's the way any roll goes. There are no rolls made until I call for them. I bring this up in your case because what this allows you to do is provide a full description without going to a dice roll, which gives you a foundation for what the players and their characters can accept as truth. This is what they absolutely know is true, like there's snow on the ground and there doesn't seem to be anybody around. And then, when they start looking for extra detail, the things that maybe other people wouldn't notice, then the dice come into play and they can begin to analyze and assess that information by keeping the base information untouched by doubt about maybe I've missed something. It's possible, as you indicate in the comments, that they were just lazy or tired or wanting the dice or you to do their job for them. And if that's the case, it will take some time to work through that. But you've asked, what should I have done? I don't think I would have carried on with it for 2 hours. I don't think I would have allowed myself to reach a level of frustration with my players where I didn't stop the game flow. Not stop the game, but stop the game flow to change up the way I was describing things. And I don't know what you did over those 2 hours, but as Sean Driscoll mentions, there is a sense of scope or scale. So if the snow is falling very quickly and very heavily, there's a chance that it could be filling in the tracks of the people who are hiding there. And once they realize that they were hungry and they needed to find food, they're going to obsessively search for food. And also, as Sean Driscoll mentioned, after a certain point of description without context, that's not exactly what I want to say, but with description without overt or explicit context, the players can become obsessed with all the details and become blinded. It's the whole forest for the trees thing. So, in a sense, trying to avoid a position where the players made a mistake and trying to avoid a position where you made a mistake and just trying to look at the situation objectively. What I've experienced in the past and what I try to avoid now is at the point where I realize that what I'm trying to communicate is not reaching them, then I look for a different way to tag the scene. So if the players have walked through all the streets of the ghost town, the characters would realize that in a way that perhaps the players don't, especially if you're not playing with maps. And, we never play with maps, so this is an ongoing thing with us. So at some point, I'll say something like, you come back to the starting point for the second or third time, and now you have a pretty good sense of what the town looks like. I'll just throw that kind of detail in there. Yeah, that's kind of a realization that the players would have, but through description, it would be extremely difficult and time-consuming to get them to realize that you weren't describing similar buildings compared to the same buildings. Things like that. So there are little bits of confirmation that you can add in on both sides. The players can be saying, okay, well, we want to move through the streets in a particular order, like from east to west, and we want to come back to the same intersection each time. They can grid off. They can make their intentions explicit. They should be making their intentions explicit. And as the game master, you provide them the details of what they see and how things are changing as the storm goes on and whatnot. But we don't have to shy away from confirming things which would be obvious on a very low and fundamental level to the characters, that through detail can make it seem not like you're describing something, but that you're hiding something. And that's a little bit of player psychology that you've just experienced. You spent 2 hours describing an empty town, and yet they didn't get it. They didn't fail to get it because there wasn't enough detail. At a certain point, they crossed over, and they started taking the detail as meaning something maybe that it doesn't. Defaulting to an intuition check, if you feel that the players are being particularly unenlightened, if you need the game to move forward, then that's what that roll is there for. If you're doing a simulation and it doesn't matter how much time you spend on this, then you don't ever need to default to that roll until the character would absolutely know something that the player is proving themselves to be completely unable to realize or think of or do on their own. In which case, we have to remember that it's not the player in that scene, it's the character. If I've got a lazy player who refuses to think for themselves, they'll be leaving my game before the stupid becomes contagious. But if someone's had an off day or whatever, as I've described in earlier clips, it may be time to break out a roll that enables them to skip over this rut that they've gotten stuck in and reorganize the information that you've been giving them in a more sensible pattern. Anyway, you're not alone. What you've described happens to everybody, particularly if you are allowing the characters to enjoy and explore the environment that you're creating in a very organic way, like you've described. If it takes 2 hours for them to get it, it takes 2 hours for them to get it. If they don't enjoy that 2-hour process, then helping them to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve from the GM's chair is a way for them to find out how to interpret what you're describing and realize that you're not hiding something, you're showing them everything.